Conference championship weekend is behind us. The one thing left to be answered: which four teams will be playing in the college football playoff? To set the scene, we had 8 teams with a realistic chance of being one of the 4 teams in the college football playoff going into this weekend. For some, it was simple: win and you're in. For others, win and get some help. And for Ohio State, it was sit at home, cross your fingers, and hope enough chaos ensued for you to sneak into the top 4. And the results are in. Washington defeats Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game. Oregon is out. Washington is in. Texas with a statement victory over Oklahoma State in the Big 12 championship game. Texas, they won, but they needed to get some help. SEC championship game. For Georgia, win and you're in. Some thought that if Alabama won, they'd be in. Others, they feel like Alabama was going to need some help. Alabama upsets number 1 Georgia 27-24. And Alabama at the last minute has the best win of the season, taking down number 1 Georgia. A Georgia team that has won 29 straight games going into this game, and Alabama takes them down. Now Georgia is on the bubble. Alabama is on the bubble. Texas is on the bubble. And the final 2 conference championship games, Michigan shuts out Iowa. Michigan is in. ACC championship game, Louisville and Florida State. Florida State down to their 3rd string quarterback. Florida State's defense carries them in this matchup, and Florida State wins 16-6. Florida State 13-0, undefeated Power 5 champion. The College Football Playoff Committee, they have never left out an undefeated Power 5 champion. But one thing they also haven't done is leave out the SEC champion. And I do think that is going to come into play. That's the overall decision here that the College Football Committee has. As it's going to be a tough decision no matter which way they go. As we have seen in the past that the committee, they have a tendency to lean towards the SEC. We saw it in 2017, I believe it was. Or was it 2018? Whichever year it was where Alabama snuck into the playoff and they ended up beating Georgia in the national championship game. I forget what year that was at the top of my head, and I do apologize. A statement that the College Football Playoff Committee chairman said that head-to-head victories are important. It's the main priority, top priority. But my thing is, we've seen in the past the College Football Playoff Committee not always honor the head-to-head. Example, last season in the final ranking. Even though it was irrelevant, it had no effect on anything. Alabama ranked ahead of Tennessee in that final ranking. Alabama was 5, Tennessee was 6. They didn't honor the head-to-head victory then. Even earlier this season, in their rankings this season, Texas was still ranked ahead of Oklahoma, even though Oklahoma had the head-to-head victory over Texas a couple weeks prior. So the College Football Playoff Committee, they are not fully innocent as far as honoring the head-to-head, which is why I think that this anticipation of the top 4, I think, is still up in the air, as I do think that there is an outside chance that any of Georgia, Alabama, Texas, Florida State, those 4 could be competing for those final 2 spots, even though Florida State, they're sitting at 13-0, being an undefeated Power 5 champion. And people would say that, well, Florida State, they don't deserve it because they really don't have a productive resume compared to a Georgia or an Alabama or even a Texas. Well, Florida State, they do have a resume here. They have a dominant win, a state win over LSU week 1. And I remember saying back in week 1 that whoever won this game was going to have the first accolade of the college football playoff season. As far as the top accolade early on. Then they have a win over Clemson on the road, which Clemson was not ranked at the time, but in the month of November, Clemson has really bounced back. They have found themselves in the top 25. A statement win over Duke, even though Duke is not the same team without quarterback Riley Leonard. And you can say the same thing for Florida State. They're not the same without Jordan Travis, which I get that. And it shows in the scoreboard, even with Jordan Travis, a couple weeks leading up into that, a 24-7 win over Pitt on November the 4th, which I do understand that Florida State was without some playmakers that day. But the next week, a 27-20 victory over Miami. And Miami, they were an up and down team throughout the season. So the ACC wasn't as strong this season as the SEC, as the SEC is always a gauntlet. They have a 24-15 win over Florida, which may not be considered a big deal, considering Florida went 5-7 this year. But it will come into play in a moment. A win over Louisville in the ACC championship game. So they do have 13-0 conference champion to their resume. On to Texas. A win over Alabama on the road. A statement win over Kansas, 40-14. Kansas 24 when they played. The loss to Oklahoma. And I am bringing that up because ever since this game, Oklahoma, they have been a completely different team. As Texas, they have the worst loss out of everyone in question. They do have a victory over Kansas State in the top 25, and a state win over Oklahoma State, a top 20 team. Now, they do have the head-to-head win over Alabama, but moving on to Alabama, the loss to Texas. They have wins over Ole Miss, Tennessee, LSU, and Kentucky. Now, Kentucky wasn't ranked that day, but Kentucky, they've been in the top 25 at some points this season. And an upset victory for Georgia, number 1 Georgia, in what is the best win of the season. To beat the number 1 team, I do feel like that's automatically the best win of the year. I think if you upset the number 1 team, especially a team that's won 29 straight games, I do think that is enough to put you over the top as far as best win of the year. Now, Georgia's resume. They don't have an SEC championship for their resume with the loss to Alabama, but they do have wins over Kentucky. Kentucky was in the top 20 on that day. A win over Missouri. Missouri's in the top 10. Ole Miss, they've been in that top 10 area for most of the season. And Tennessee. And if you look at Georgia compared to Alabama, I do bring this up because as far as who were the 4 best teams in college football for the committee to think about, Georgia has defeated Kentucky, Ole Miss, and Tennessee more productively than Alabama. But as far as my overall thoughts, I think no matter what, it's going to be controversy. And I think it's very fitting that in the final year of this 4-team format, that it will end in controversy. Which angle does the committee go off of? Do they go off of who is the most deserving, or is it the 4 best teams in college football? Because if you do it based on most deserving, Michigan, Washington, Florida State, and Texas. Because Texas, even though Alabama, they took down number 1, Texas has a head-to-head victory over the team that upset number 1. So I do think head-to-head that would be the deciding factor into that. But if you did it based off the 4 best teams, it'd be pretty difficult. I'd say 4 best teams: Michigan, Washington, Alabama, and honestly, probably Georgia, even though Texas, they do have that head-to-head win over Alabama. Alabama, they are a completely different team now than in week 2. I get that the upset did take place, but I do feel like if Texas and Alabama, if they had a rematch next week, I think Alabama would win based off of the way Alabama has played ever since that loss. Ever since conference play, Alabama has been a completely different team. And especially with Alabama coming off of an upset victory over number one, I think Alabama, they could win in a rematch. And honestly, I do feel like Georgia is still one of the four best teams in college football, as it's difficult to rank these six teams as far as which four you think are the best. Because I think Georgia would beat Florida State pretty handily. I think Georgia could beat Washington. I think Georgia could beat Michigan. I think Georgia can even beat Texas. Going into the season, I feel like the one team that could beat Georgia this season is Alabama. And I've already seen Alabama beat Georgia this season. So I feel like if you're doing it based on the four best teams, I think you have to probably put Georgia in there. Probably have to put, even though Texas with the head-to-head victory, I don't know, I do think that if Georgia and Texas played head-to-head next week, I think Georgia would get the victory. And I think it would actually be close. Because I still feel like the only team that could beat Georgia is Alabama, and that's been the case since November of 2020. The only team that's beaten Georgia since then has been Alabama. But if you want my opinion for the top four teams, Michigan, Washington, Florida State, and Texas, as far as which teams are deserving, as I do honor the head-to-head that Texas has over Alabama. But does the committee think the same way? If you're asking me who are the four best teams in college football, I would actually say that Georgia is one of the top four teams in college football. I'd say Alabama is. I would say that Washington is. And I would say that Michigan is. As I do think that Michigan could beat Texas, but Michigan, they have not won a bowl game under Jim Harbaugh. And Jim Harbaugh, he does have a history of not performing at playoff time. So I do think that is a factor. But either way, this is going to be an exhausting and long night for the College Football Playoff Committee. Comment your thoughts down below. Who should be the top four teams in the playoff? Like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time,